Welcome to Small Talk by Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. On this episode of Small Talk, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Fisch, who is the rabbi of Eitz Chaim Synagogue in Jacksonville, Florida, and is the author of the newly published Haggadah, The Winding Road of Redemption, which is published by Mosaic Press. So thank you, Rabbi Fisch, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
What can you tell listeners about this Haggadah?
Well, there are so many Haggadahs out there, and the notion of publishing a new Haggadah seems to be like, in one sense, like adding another drop to the ocean. So I guess the question also can be like, what am I adding by this Haggadah? And I feel like there's so many different angles on Torah in general and Haggadah in particular, that there's always room to continue to delve in it, as we learn in Pirkei Avos from Bagbag, and there's always something else to say. So my perspective about this particular Haggadah, The Winding Road of Redemption, really the objective is for not to be a disconnect between the text of the Haggadah and our personal lives. Really to imagine ourselves in a process of redemption, just like there was once upon a time Yetzias Mitzrayim, and on the macro level for Klal Yisrael. But in our lives, many times we don't see the parallels. So, objective number one is to become real for everybody. And number two, I guess it's also embedded in the title, it's the winding road of redemption. And, not to be too Talmudic with the diak over here, but it's not the winding road to redemption, because as I point out many times in the Haggadah, that redemption is not a destination. We continue to have ups and downs in life, both on a national level and on a personal level. And therefore, we continue to evolve on the winding road of redemption.
So you answered the question of why another Haggadah and what you're doing that makes you stand out that's a little different. And we'll get more into that when you give an example or two, and we'll talk a little about Haggadah. But I think one can ask also a related question, which is, why did you decide to write a Haggadah, right? There are so many Haggadahs. Why did you decide, okay, I'm going to write a commentary on the Haggadah?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I've always been passionate about the Seder and the Haggadah in general. I've always, since I was a little kid, I think it's the highlight of my Jewish calendar. And so I, over the years, spent a lot of time thinking about different aspects and coming up with different insights, and therefore kind of evolved into, the publication of this Haggadah. I just will add one other point, and that is that I would say approximately about 80% of the commentary, my commentary, the Haggadah, is original content. About, the balance is, quoting other, well-known or illustrious, Mefarshim commentaries, but approximately 80% is original content. That's not to take away from any other wonderful commentaries, and they're going to quoting all sorts of Mefarshim and commentaries. But I felt if I'm going to be putting forward something, it should have my personal stamp on it. So it's been over the years. I'm the Rav of the shul here in Jacksonville, and it's been a compilation of different drashas that I've given over the years on Pesach and different insights that we shared at our Seder over the years as well.
Now, how did you get to the winding road of redemption to be the theme and kind of the name of the Haggadah? And you talked about this before, but if one looks at the cover of this Haggadah, which Mosaic did a great job on the cover, it literally has a winding through the words. It goes from Haggadah to winding road. It goes it's going back and forth across the page. And you actually did this also at the page where you lay out Kadesh, Orchatz, Karpat, Yachas. You have the same thing. It winds through. You have this kind of nice design. So what's the story behind that?
It kind of evolved. I didn't start off with a particular theme per se, and try to connect it around those dots, so to speak. I rather just started. Was actually going to Israel in the summer of 2019 for several weeks, and I had some free time, and I said, you know what? I've always had this project. I want to start a Haggadah, and so I spent a few days just putting together some original thoughts. Came back, the following year was COVID, got distracted, prioritized other things. And it really took me a couple years to, settle down and make this a priority. I realized as I was writing and as I was putting this together, there kept on being a compelling theme of personal redemption, and how do we find that, and how do we achieve that, and how do we connect our story, our personal stories, to the macro story of Klal Yisrael's redemption. So over time, as I continued to release the content, I was releasing it for myself internally, I realized there was this theme, and that's how it kind of evolved to the winding road of redemption.
Okay, so let's talk about some examples from the Haggadah. As you mentioned, and it jumps out, anyone opening the Haggadah is original content. It's not like a likud. And you can, I think, tell also, because when you open it, you have Shtiklach Torah on Orchatz and Karpas and Yachatz. Many Haggadahs you open up, there's nothing there, right? They start with Magid. There's nothing in the beginning. There's no Shtiklach Torah. Some do, but most of them don't have. So I think that right away was like, okay, this must be interesting. At least, new content. So if you, I don't know if you want to give an example from there, or you want to give from Magid, from a classical piece, wherever you want to give examples. I'll turn it over to you just to give some examples from the Haggadah.
Yeah, great question. And I guess I'll give a couple examples from the parts of the Seder that are not, so well discussed. Let's say I start with Yachatz, for example. So the part of Yachatz in the Seder, of course, is you take the middle matzah and you break it in to half, and the larger half goes for the afikomen, that's to be hidden, and the smaller half goes back into the ka'ara with the other matzahs. So I talk about this idea of our dual identities, and I mentioned this a couple times in Haggadah, our dual identities that we have as Jewish people. On the one hand, we on the Seder night in particular, but in general, we have this identity of former avadim, former slaves, and that's what we remember on Seder night, that we once upon a time were avadim, slaves. And on the other hand, it's a celebration. It's a celebration of our freedom, and we can't be attached to either rather of these ideas, because if we become too attached to we were avadim, we were slaves, we're gonna evolve into an identity of victimhood, and that's never a good identity to internalize. On the other hand, we can become too proud that we're free, we have rights, we have, we're full, because there has to be a tinge of humility. There has to be a tinge of humility, because otherwise we're going to get too carried away with this comfortable position. So there has to be this balance. And in life, there's a certain tension between these two ideas. And that's why we break it in half. The larger half, which represents Safon, we'll talk about Safon in a moment. The larger half is ultimately we're free people, but we also devote a smaller half to Yachas, to remember the matzah. Now the matzah itself has a dual identity. Matzah has an identity of freedom, which we say in the middle of the Seder Barad Gamliel, matzah zu shan ochel hashuma. Why do we eat the matzah? Because we didn't have a chance to bake it at the time of our freedom, and we rushed out. So that represents freedom. Whereas in the beginning of the Seder, it refers to the matzah as halach ma'anya. This is the poor man's bread. So matzah really has this dual identity, and then we break it in half to really demonstrate that dual identity. So that's an idea with Yachatz. Another example I can share, I'll share about Safon, because I don't think Safon is too widely discussed. Safon is not widely discussed, and really Safon is about finding the afikomen, but it's kind of a strange practice. Why do we have to hide the afikomen? Why can't we just? And the conventional response is that we hide it in order to keep the kids awake, and they shouldn't fall asleep, and that we keep them excited. Okay, I'm not coming to disagree or challenge that long-standing minhag, but just wanted to add a different perspective, and that is that it's based the idea based upon the Gemara. What the Gemara says, famously, there were these different Amoraim, Talmudic sages at the end of Shemona Esrei. They used to insert their personal tefillos, their personal prayers, and one of the Muram, his name was Rabbi Alexandri, and he said that Ribbon Shalom, our will, Ritzonenu, our will is lasos r'tzonecha. Really, every Jew wants to do the will of Hashem. We really want to do the will of Hashem. We all want to, in our ultimate core essence, we want to do the will of Hashem. But Mama Akev, what's stopping us? So he says two things. So'ar shebe'isa, which literally means the sourdough, that of the dough, and then also Rishib and Malchios, external pressures from the regimes. But let's just talk about the first thing for a moment. What is So'ar shebe'isa? What does it have to do with? So Rashi says that So'ar shebe'isa, Rashi famously says it's referring to the Yetzer Hara. So there's this, because the chametz is identified with the Yetzer Hara, we go to extremes when it comes to chametz on Pesach, to getting rid of chametz. So, for example, bedikas chametz. There's a mitzvah to search for chametz. There's a mitzvah to search for chametz before Pesach. There's no mitzvah, for example, just to parallel, I write about this as well. There's no mitzvah. Let's say if you rent an Airbnb or you rent an apartment, and you know that somebody was cooking bacon before, you got to kasher the kitchen, but there's no bedikas bacon. Let's do bedikas, cheeseburgers. Bedika, there's no, but when it comes to chametz, we go nuclear. We're trying to eradicate the smallest things. So what's this idea? This idea is that the chametz represents the Yetzer Hara, and therefore we want to really peel away all these exteriors, and we want to get to what's safman, what's hidden within every single Jew. What's hidden with every single Jew is this idea of rotzonenu lasos ritzanecha. It's our will to do your will, and that's why we have these, the practice of looking for something, but really that's indicating a much deeper mission over here, which is to find the uncovered spark within every Jew.
Who would you say the Haggadah is meant for?
I would say it's a great question. I would say it's a wide audience, but anybody that's looking to get more out of the Seder. If you're a person that just was at the Seder for however many years, and you feel like, I'm not sure how much I'm connecting to it. I'm just really, mouthing words which I've been mouthing for years, and he's saying over vorts that I've been saying over for years, but I don't feel like such a connection. I would say read this Haggadah because there's a very, very high likelihood you'll feel more of a personal connection to the Seder. What
are you trying to accomplish with this Haggadah?
I'm trying to accomplish that when someone comes away from Pesach, it was a really meaningful, not only Seder, but Pesach in general. And the idea of really having this immersive experience. You mentioned orchatz before. I talked about an orchatz that there's, it doesn't say netila. We don't call it netila, but it's netila sedayim. But orchatz normally means like a full body immersion. There's a difference between, I talk about, if you learn a foreign language, let's say you want to learn French, for example. So you can just go learn something online, or you can actually go to a school, a classroom where we'll call it French immersion school. Like the classroom language is in French. You want to go to the bathroom, or you want to go get a snack, you have to speak it's an immersive language. So when it comes to the Seder, it's not supposed to be some sort of cursory experience, some superficial experience. It's supposed to be immersive, and that's indicated by the word orchatz. And my hope is that because somebody used this commentary, the Winding Road of Redemption, as a something that accompanied them at the Seder, that will have a more meaningful Pesach, and that would give them like a boost for the rest of the year as well.
Now, finally, you said before, and we explained throughout, that it's really original, new material, new content. But you do have some sources in here. And besides the sources, there's, I'm sure, inspiration for a lot of the Torah that you take inspiration from. So what are those sources, or even if they're not quoted, but where you take inspiration for your Torah from?
A great question. Definitely do quote, several notable mafarshim in this Haggadah. In addition to that, in terms of my own, where I get my inspiration from, it's interesting. I feel like I'm evolving over like every year or two. I'm have this sefer, which I get very, very attached to. And that almost becomes my go-to. And for a while it was Nesiv Shalom. I was just I couldn't absorb it quick enough. I couldn't consume it. Every Nesiv Shalom on the Parsha, on the Parsha, on Chanukah, and Purim, and Pirkei Avos, I have every aspect of anything he wrote, I'm like try to consume as quickly as possible. More recently, and actually put something in the Haggadah for that, was also with about Reb Tzadok. Tzidkas Tzadok. I find Reb Tzadok's messages very, not only inspirational, but very eye-opening and very much, uplifting in the sense that like there's like a whole new world that's discovered. It's like you've entered a new world. At least that's the way I feel when I come study the words of Reb Tzadok and Drush, of course.
Okay, well, thank you for coming on the podcast to discuss the Winding Road of Redemption Haggadah. I will link to it in the show notes. It's available in Sfarim stores, it's available on Amazon, it's available on Mosaic Press, and as always with Mosaic Press, you can use code CHATTER, CHATTER, for 15% off. And thank you, Rabbi Fisch, for joining me.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.